Hello, health champions. Today, I want to talk about the top 10 superfoods that can help heal your heart. And just to get the basics of that process, let's talk about what healing really is. So first of all, in order for us to restore function, to restore tissue, to rebuild the body, we're going to need certain raw materials. So we need to provide those from the diet. And those raw materials are going to have things like quality protein and fat, including essential fatty acids, essential amino acids, and of course, vitamins and minerals. So this tissue that we're talking about, that's the cells of the body. We're constantly breaking, wearing out cells, and we need to replace them with new ones. So the body that you have today is 90% different. 90% of the cells are new since last year. So we need these quality raw materials to replace the old cells. And then to drive that process forward, we also need clean fuel. Everything that happens needs some energy. We need some fuel to make energy from, and we need it to burn clean so it doesn't create a bunch of damage along the way while we're trying to restore this tissue and these cells and this function. And then more than anything, we need to stop breaking it. We need to stop doing all the things that created the damage in the first place. And that means to stop inflammation, to stop oxidative stress, and to stop toxins. So all of these are man-made things that are not part of whole food. They're preservatives, they're additives, they're pesticides, but also heavy metals and chemicals in our environment, in our cleaning product, in our personal care products, and so forth. The more we can clean that up, the more we reduce the overall body burden. And then we add in the thing that most people usually start thinking about, the medicinal plants and herbs that can have certain properties that might be antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, antifungal, that can help restore some balance in the body and help us clean it up a little bit. But we don't start there. We start with providing the right things and removing the wrong things. And these foods are in no particular order, but we're going to start with foods that are high in omega-3 fatty acids. And that would be from fish, such as salmon and sardines, but there are other fish as well. But they're going to be mostly in fatty fish. And one other kind would be small mackerel would be a good source. But larger fish are going to contain more heavy metals and more pesticides because they're higher in the food chain and they have lived longer to accumulate these toxins. And the super important component that we need is EPA and DHA, these fatty acids that become part of the cell membranes. Remember, we're replacing cells, we're building cells that are healthier, then we need healthy components for those cells. And what I want to talk about in this video is that virtually every food is good for somebody and not so great for somebody. So we need to understand the factors that can make it good or not so good. So these fatty acids, they are generally going to help you reduce inflammation as long as you don't react to them. So that's green plus there. That's to indicate a positive aspect. And then they also, it's a good thing that they contain very, very few anti-nutrients, not like plants have certain defense mechanisms to keep from getting eaten. And we're going to talk a lot about that as well. But this fish can contain a compound called histamine, which is a chemical messenger that the body makes naturally. And it serves many different functions we'll talk about. But some people can be sensitive, and we can also get too much of this histamine. So that would be a negative. And if you have this sensitivity, you could basically develop allergy symptoms if you're getting too much histamine. So what is histamine? Well, it's a very important signaling molecule that the body uses. So it uses it on purpose, but we can get too much in certain situations. So people who have allergic reactions to airborne allergies, for example, they are having an excessive reaction. They're having too much histamine and they're getting sensitized to it. But histamine is also signaling in the function of making gastric acid secretion when you make your stomach acid, and also in the sleep-wake cycles it has a function as well as in cognitive function. So it's a normal compound and it's very important, but we need to keep it in balance. And there are several sources of this. Of course, because it's natural to the body produces it. It floats around in little white blood cells called basophils primarily. But also we can have other bacteria in the body and bacteria on things around us that can produce more of it. And we can also have it part of spoiling food. So when food gets older, then it makes more histamine. So sometimes just having leftovers is not such a great idea. It's not as good as eating the fresh food in this regard. But also when we age food on purpose, like we're aging cheese, for example, or aging wine, then they can develop more histamine in that process. And also in fermentation, something that for the most part is very, very healthy. If we ferment certain foods, we're making bacteria that can be good for us, but we also run the risk of making more histamine. And another source of histamine is in our gut bacteria. So if you have an abundance of the strains that make histamine, then you can already be kind of sensitized and predisposed to these reactions. The next group of high omega-3 foods are from plants. And here we have things like flaxseed and chia seed and walnuts, where flax and chia are by far the most abundant sources. And outside of these three, there's not really another rich source of omega-3s. And the type of omega-3 in plants is called ALA, alpha-linolenic acid. And the difference here between that and the fish oil is that in plants, we start off with this alpha-linolenic acid, which is classified as an essential fatty acid because the body cannot make that. We have to add it from the outside. However, the body can make the EPA and then it can convert that into DHA. So these two, the EPA and the DHA, that's the final end product that the body is looking for. So by eating the EPA and the DHA, we already have it supplied in its final form. And because the body can make it, it's not classified as an essential fatty acid. However, the conversion from ALA to EPA is very, very poor. So that's why it's not the best source, and it's usually not sufficient to only eat plant-sourced omega-3s, because as little as 1% of this ALA may end up as becoming DHA, which is what we need. So this is why I consider the EPA and the DHA as more essential, even though classically speaking, the ALA is the essential one. But just like the other EPAs, because it is an omega-3, it helps the body in reducing and controlling and balancing inflammation. And one way it does that is the more omega-3s that you eat, whether it can become the final version of EPA or DHA or not, it still helps balance out the omega-6s so that we don't get these sky-high 20-to-1, 30-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratios that we see. So simply by eating some more of this, you're already balancing out that inflammation. So those are the positive aspects of this, but then there are people who react to these because they contain phytates, which is an anti-nutrient, and it can cause digestive upset for some people. And in doing that, of course, it creates more inflammation. So it's not this simple always that we say, oh, omega-3 foods, they reduce inflammation, because it's not that clean cut. And also, this phytate, this anti-nutrient, it can block mineral absorption. So it basically, if it's in the food that you eat it with, so these foods, they're great, they're full of fiber and good fats and good proteins and minerals, but the phytates in that food will bind to some of the minerals so we can't absorb them and we just flush them out. So it's going to reduce the absorption rate of these minerals by a certain percentage. But it's only blocking when it's with the food that you're eating at the time. So it's not like this is an ongoing effect for weeks or months. Another omega-3 food is actually grass-fed meat, and it doesn't have a ton of omega-3s in it, but it is very, very nutrient dense. It has a lot of good stuff that your body is looking for. And if it's grass-fed, it's also going to have a good omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, basically a 1-to-1 ratio if that animal was healthy and lived its life the way it's supposed to and ate the things that were innate to it. So even though it's not a super rich source of omega-3s, it still helps to balance these omega-6s. And it also has no anti-nutrients. It doesn't have any of these plant compounds that interfere. But meat, especially if it's aged a little bit, can contain histamines, which in some people, again, cause reactions and increase inflammation. And another source of omega-3 I want to mention is cod liver oil, because it may be the most abundant source of these fatty acids that we have that's easily available. So it's very high in omega-3s, and it has both of the EPA and the DHA, plenty. And it also has vitamin A and vitamin D. And it's very rich in both of these vitamins, and it is the most bioavailable vitamin. It's not like a precursor that we have to convert to something else. It is the highest bioavailability. But cod liver oil can still have some of this histamine that we're talking about. And if you eat it on a regular basis, it is so potent, it is so rich in these vitamin A and D that you can develop toxicity. So if you're eating this on a regular basis, I would really figure out how much you can tolerate to measure your levels of vitamin A and D so you don't overdo it. Another very healing food is high sulfur foods, and these are going to be primarily plant foods. We have things like garlic and onion, we have broccoli and cabbage. And these high sulfur foods, they support vascular health, they help reduce inflammation, and they very much support the body in its detox processes in the liver. And these foods contain two amino acids called cysteine and methionine that contain the sulfur, and they are precursors for something called glutathione, which is the body's #1 antioxidant. It's an antioxidant that the body relies on and that it manufactures internally, but it needs these sulfur-rich foods in order to do it. But these high sulfur foods can also cause reactions and digestive upset in some people with severe bloating. And this is if you have an abundance of the bacterial species that degrade, that break down these sulfur compounds. And especially if these reside in the small intestine, called small intestine bacterial overgrowth, where we're not supposed to have a bunch of bacteria, but still it's extremely common for people to have an overgrowth of these. And then these bacteria will break down the sulfur and make something called hydrogen sulfide. And you get all this bloating and this unpleasant sensation. So I know what you're saying now. Why does it have to be so hard? Why is it that everything is good and bad? What is there left to eat? What am I supposed to eat? How do we figure this out? And one of my favorite ways is to go back and look at our ancestors and say, well, what did they eat? What's our ancestral foods? And I believe it's pretty close to a paleo diet. I don't want to treat paleo like a religion and say 100% black and white that this is how it is, but I think it's a great benchmark. It's a great foundation for what we're supposed to eat. And the question then is, how did our ancestors cope with this food? How did they tolerate the food? Because we've eaten a wide variety of animal and plant foods, and that has contained oxalates and phytates and polyphenols, lectins, sulfur, anti-nutrients. It's contained tannins and flavonoids. And then along the way, humans have learned to ferment things, and we are increasing with aging of foods, we are increasing the histamines, but also fish and meat already contains some histamine. So how did our ancestors deal with this? How come it was good food for them, but now it's also complicated? And the answer is that these compounds are actually for the most part, extremely beneficial. But they're not beneficial to you. They are beneficial to your microbiome because you have bacteria that produce some of these compounds, and you have bacteria that degrade some of the compounds. So our ancestors tended to have a very good balance between the different species in their bacterial flora. But due to our modern lifestyle, we have changed all that. So now we have small intestine bacterial overgrowth. We're not supposed to have much bacteria in the small intestine, but because of imbalances, they have been allowed to flourish there. Another very common imbalance is H. pylori. Most people used to have H. pylori, but now it's like either we have none or we have too much. And when we have these imbalances, now we create more inflammation in the gut, we create more leaky gut, and then all of these compounds that we talked about, plus all of the metabolic waste and toxins from pathogenic bacteria, now they can cross that gut membrane, that barrier, and get into the bloodstream and cause all these different food reactions. Another thing that can be very beneficial to your heart is high nitrate foods. And these can be things like beets and spinach and pomegranate, and there's hundreds of others. So these are just a few examples. And these nitrates, they help the body make something called nitric oxide, which is another signaling molecule that causes vasodilation. And in order for your body to vasodilate, it needs this nitric oxide. And vasodilation means that the blood vessel becomes bigger. It relaxes so that you can send more blood through. So oftentimes, if you have pain in the chest area called angina, it's because the blood vessels are too constricted, and by helping the body make more of this vasodilating compound, we can relax the blood vessels and have more blood go through to the muscle. But then on the downside, of course, beets and spinach have a lot of oxalates, especially spinach, and this can cause digestive upsets, but it can also bind with calcium and form kidney stones. And then the pomegranates have some of these histamines that we talked about. And anytime you talk about nitrates, people automatically think about sodium nitrate or sodium nitrite, which is a preservative that they use in deli products. So you want the meat and the ham and the bacon to look nice and pink, and sodium nitrate is what maintains that color and that flavor. And a lot of people associate this sodium nitrate with cancer as being a bad preservative. And most of the risk, the vast majority of the bad aspect of sodium nitrate is that when you put it in meat products that have something called amines, then if you combine that with high heat, such as scorching something on the grill, now you're going to create something called nitrosamines. And these are the carcinogens. But the sodium nitrate in itself is not a carcinogen. The vast majority of the risk comes from combining it with high heat. And then also people sometimes ask, well, if sodium nitrate can become a nitrosamine, then what about these vegetables? Can we grill vegetables? Doesn't that also form these nitrosamines? But first of all, there's less amines in vegetables. And even though theoretically you could make some nitrosamine from vegetables by grilling them, they contain antioxidants that are going to offset that effect. So it's really just when you use very high heat on deli products such as hot dogs that have sodium nitrate, it's that combination that's bad. And then we have the foods with a healthy fat in it. And fat is the best source of energy for the body if it is a healthy fat, if it's a stable fat that runs nice and clean. And one such fat is from avocados. And we have monounsaturated fatty acids. More than 70% of the fat in avocado is monounsaturated, just like olive oil. So that's a positive. But avocados, unfortunately, can contain some histamines. Again, some people may be sensitive to that. And then we have olives, and both avocado and olives technically are a fruit. So they don't have a whole lot of these anti-nutrients that a lot of plants have. And you can eat the olive, or you can turn it into extra virgin olive oil. And the olives contain these polyphenols that are actually an excellent source of fuel for a lot of the bacteria in the gut, the beneficial bacteria. But there are also some people who react to these polyphenols. So that's kind of a two-edged sword there. And even though olive oil and monounsaturated fatty acids are very, very stable compared to most other plant oils, it's not as stable as saturated fat. And if we keep it on the counter too long, or if we heat it too much, or we don't store it properly, it can become rancid, and now that can produce a little bit of inflammation in the body. And almonds are another source of these healthy fats. It has a lot of monounsaturated fatty acids in it. However, almonds are also full of oxalates and phytates. So when people go low carb and they're looking for substitutes for flour, and they start eating almonds and almond flour around the clock, now a lot of people are going to develop sensitivities to almonds because of the oxalates and the phytates. So if you start eating almonds because you're going low carb, don't overdo it, and realize that if you overdo it, you probably will develop a sensitivity. And then we have pastured eggs, which is a great source of healthy fats. And that is if you get the pastured eggs. If you get the cheap mass-produced eggs, they could have an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of 20 to 1, whereas the pastured eggs are going to be close to 1 to 1. So again, it all depends on how you feed these animals. If they are raised the way they're supposed to, the way they're supposedly live and eat innately, then you're going to get healthy food. If you let mankind intervene with industrialized products and chemicals, now it turns out completely differently. So eggs are incredibly nutrient dense. I've done separate videos on eggs where I go through that in more detail. But one of the most important nutrient is called choline. It's a B vitamin, and it serves so many different functions in the body that are good for you and good for the heart and good for the liver. But again, it's like there is no totally perfect food, because eggs can still contain histamines. And then we have the organ meats, and these are things like liver, heart, and kidney. And it used to be that those were the most treasured parts of the animal, and we gave the lean meat and as leftovers to the dogs. But of course today that's completely turned around, and virtually nobody eats these organ meats anymore, which is unfortunate because they're incredibly nutrient dense. They're full of vitamins like A, B12, mineral like zinc, and a very important cofactor called CoQ10 that helps your cells make energy. And because it's not a plant, it's very low or absent of these anti-nutrients, but unfortunately, it does have histamines. And another type of organ meat we don't usually think about is cod liver pate. So of course, when they take the cod liver and they make cod liver oil from it, it's because it's so rich in these nutrients of omega-3, the EPA, and the DHA that we talked about. So typically you're going to buy this cod liver pate in a jar, and you can get them on Amazon, for example. But even though it's a fairly small jar, it's typically too much for one person. So you probably want to try to split it with 2 people. And you don't want to save it, because the next day it's going to be spoiled. It's going to taste and smell extremely fishy. When you get it perfectly fresh, it is very, very fresh. It's completely neutral. It has no odor or any bad flavor. But the next day it's going to taste pretty rancid, because it's so high in these EPA and DHA that it starts reacting almost immediately. And another positive is that, just like the cod liver oil, it's very high in vitamin A and D, the bioavailable kind. But unfortunately, it does have some histamines, and just like the cod liver oil, you can also get vitamin A and D toxicity. So this is not something you want to check the dosage on the can and figure out how much you can tolerate. And this is not something that you want to eat every day, or you're going to be pretty much guaranteed to develop toxicity. And then there are some foods that are very high in antioxidants, so they can counteract this oxidative stress. Whenever we use oxygen to make energy, we create free radicals. It's unavoidable. But if we have the right kinds of natural antioxidants, they can offset that. They can neutralize those free radicals. And we have things like blueberries that are very high in antioxidants, and they contain something called anthocyanins. And like we said, that helps reduce oxidative stress, and it helps improve vascular health. Unfortunately, we have oxalates in blueberries, so if you're super sensitive to that, that could be a problem. Another popular antioxidant food is chocolate or cacao. It's the bean. And of course, the benefit is not from the sugar in the chocolate, it is from the bean itself. So you either want to eat the darkest chocolate that you can, or you want to make maybe a drink from the cacao and sweeten it with stevia or something like that. But this cacao contains an antioxidant called flavonoids. It is also very high in magnesium, which most people are low in. It will help reduce oxidative stress. It will support vascular health, just like blueberries. But again, it has both oxalates and histamine in it. Another popular antioxidant food is green tea. And it contains catechins that can have all sorts of benefits. It reduces oxidative stress and supports vascular health. On the downside, it has something called tannins and caffeine. Also, tomatoes have antioxidants. There's one in particular that is almost unique to tomatoes, or at least emphasized frequently, called lycopene. It's known to reduce oxidative stress, but also to balance out your cholesterol. But tomatoes contain both histamine and lectins. Tomatoes is what's called a nightshade. And lectins are sticky proteins that can create problems in your gut. Now, how did it get so complicated? I don't want you to start thinking about all these foods as bad, because they are mostly good. And these things that we're talking about that they contain, they were never a problem until we developed imbalances in the body. So it's not like they're bad for you, it's that they can be bad for some people if you have too much. But the reason we're out of balance, the reason we don't tolerate these, the reason we don't process them, is that we live in a man-made world. We have changed the world more in the last 50 years than the previous 50,000. And one of the biggest things that I talk about all the time is insulin resistance because of processed foods, because of sugar and seed oil. We have created a very unhealthy metabolic environment in the body with low-grade inflammation. We have a toxicity that humans never had ever before. It comes from pollutions and pesticides, food additives, chemicals, cleaning products. And it's really tragic how much we've changed things, because we used to have our kids play in the dirt. We used to be exposed to all these different bacteria. Our bodies learned to interact with them and develop a healthy balance. And we needed those bacteria. And now instead, we have developed germ phobia. Everything has to be totally sterilized. And instead, we spray down every surface with chemicals. And now we add to this toxic burden, and we clean out all the bacteria, some of which we actually needed. And the next big thing I believe that we have to start looking at is dysbiosis. That's the balance of bacteria in the gut, because they really process everything that comes through you. Everything that you eat, they have the last say in processing and packaging and making it available to you or getting rid of it. And when we take things like antibiotics, when we overuse them, they don't just kill off the bad bacteria, the infection that you're trying to get rid of, they kill off a lot of the good ones. And if you've had multiple courses of antibiotics, which most people have, then a lot of your species are not just out of balance, but a lot of them are completely extinct. And then, of course, processed foods will aggravate that process even further. And then we have factors like stress and COVID, the recent pandemic, which is a virus that creates a leaky gut and also alters our bacterial flora. And then we have fiber-rich foods. And fiber can be really, really good for us because it can help feed and balance our gut bacteria. But it can work the other way as well. So some people who don't tolerate fiber very well, it's because they have an abundance of pathogenic bacteria, and of course the fiber is going to feed those bacteria as well. And two sources of fiber that we talked about is chia and flax seed. Besides being very high in omega-3s, they're also high in fiber, and the fiber can bind to some of the cholesterol and prevent reabsorption. So some people have high cholesterol because they're what's called hyperabsorbers. They reabsorb way too much cholesterol. And then if you eat more fiber, then that can help bind and flush some of that out and prevent reabsorption. And in the case of chia and flax, they help balance the omega-6s because they're very rich in omega-3s. But unfortunately, they contain these phytates, these anti-nutrients that can keep us from absorbing minerals and also cause some digestive upset for some people. Another popular food is sweet potato. It's very high in fiber. It is very nutrient dense. It is a paleo food. It's a tuber. And it's very low in anti-nutrients. It's pretty remarkable for being a plant that it doesn't have a lot of the traditional chemical defenses that a lot of plants have. But then some people say that it helps regulate blood sugar. It helps lower blood sugar. And then I want to ask, compared to what? Compared to steak and broccoli, or compared to popcorn and soda? Because sweet potato is still a very high carb, it's a very high starch, and it even has a lot of sugar because it tastes sweet. So it does have sucrose and fructose, not like a soda, but much more than just about any other plant food. And it has a high glycemic index, meaning it will raise your blood sugar. Again, not as much as junk food, but there are many other alternatives that will control your blood sugar much better. And then there's a category of food you may have heard of called FODMAP. It stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And that's a type of short fibers that can feed certain bacteria. So if you have that bacteria and you eat FODMAP foods, then you'll get a lot of gas and bloating. Another type of food that's important for heart health is foods rich in vitamin C and flavonoids. So we have citrus foods like lemon and orange that can support heart health. They are actually very low in anti-nutrients. Usually the fruits are much lower in anti-nutrients than other vegetables and plant foods. So of course the thing with fruit is that it has a lot of sugar. So between the lemon and the orange, I would stick with the lemon. I use a lot of lemon. I squeeze it into water. I use it in cooking a lot, whereas the orange is going to have the sugar content's going to be on the high end. And again, it's going to depend on how insulin resistant you are. If you're a type 2 diabetic, then you probably want to avoid the orange and stick with the lemon. But if you're very insulin sensitive, a few fruits like orange now and then are not going to hurt you. But I would still suggest staying away from the orange juice, which is a processed food where the sugar is just floating around waiting to be absorbed. And then we have bell pepper, which also has these vitamin C and flavonoids, but it has lectins. It is a nightshade, just like the tomato and just like eggplant, that there are certain people who are very sensitive to these lectins, and then you definitely want to avoid them. And then we have fermented food. And this is where you preserve food with bacteria. They create an acidic environment. They consume some of the sugar in the food, and these bacteria can help populate your gut and can help suppress some of the pathogenic bacteria. And the classic one, of course, is sauerkraut made from cabbage. And then there's an Asian version called kimchi. You have kefir and yogurt, which are fermented dairy. You have miso and tempeh, which is fermented soybeans. And then you have various different vegetables like pickles, beets, and carrots that can also be fermented. Just make sure that they are fermented and not simply pickled or brined. So these fermented foods, they contain probiotics. They contain these bacteria that can help populate the gut. And then what you want to do is you want to feed the probiotics with prebiotics. So that's what prebiotics are. It's the food that bacteria consume. And here we have some of these things like garlic, onion, leek, and apples. But again, keep in mind that the FODMAP that we talked about is also, the onion and garlic is also part of the FODMAP. They are fermentable. So depending on your bacterial balance, you may do really well with these, or they could actually aggravate things. Other good prebiotics are things like asparagus, chicory root, and any other source of fiber. And on the positive side, these can support gut health, but on the negative side, they can aggravate your gut health. So again, these things, everything that we talked about in this video is good for you until you have a reaction. So that's how you know. If you do well with the food, if you have no bloating, no diarrhea, no constipation, no rashes, no sneezing, then you tolerate these foods well, and then they're good for you. But if you have symptoms, then they are aggravating to you and they're not good for you. But the long-term solution is not simply to avoid all of the things that we've talked about, because they are this wide variety of food that ideally you need, ideally will benefit you in the long run. So what we need to do is we need to figure out how can we become more tolerant of them? How can we change our gut flora to where we can process and degrade these things in a healthy way? So then the big question is, of course, how do we approach this? What do we do to restore this balance that we're talking about, to where we can tolerate foods that are good for us? Well, what you want to do is you make changes slowly. You try to pay attention to which foods you do well with and which foods that aggravate you, that cause a problem. And then you monitor and you notice, is anything changing? Is anything getting worse? Well, if it's getting better, if you feel better, then you're on the right track. But introduce these one at a time, introduce them slowly, and pay attention. And if you feel better, then great. Now you continue, you introduce more of the food, you introduce different types of food. And of course, the key is to, before you do this, you have to stop all the crap that created the problem in the first place. So you can't keep eating processed foods and sugar and soda and chemicals and pesticides and expect for your body to be able to heal. So that's like the prerequisite. First, you cut out the garbage and then you start this process. And then if you introduce something and you feel worse, then you stop. Then your body wasn't ready, or it was the wrong thing, or it was too much. So now you try again, you try something else, you try slower. Now, if you figure out this process and you get better, then great. You're home free, just keep continuing, learn more, and keep living well. But if you do a few rounds of trial and error and it doesn't seem like you get anywhere, then you probably want to get some help. And you could find someone locally who does functional medicine, who is really skilled in these sort of things. But more than anything, you want to start measuring. You want to start understanding what's going on. Because if you're not resolving it by simple means, you need more information. And the place to start, I believe, is with blood work. And if you really want to start understanding blood work and the comprehensive panel, not just individual markers, but optimal ranges and how everything fits together, I want to highly recommend a blood work course that I developed. So it's online. You can do it at your own pace. And there you can learn a lot about the body and a lot about how to interpret your blood work. Because chances are, if you just go to a standard doctor, they're probably not really going to understand anything about blood work except where the flags are and where you're outside of a range. And then in addition to the course, we also have a group. I have a telehealth panel. It's a group of doctors that will do a consult for you. So I would recommend getting the blood work and the course so that you can learn as much as possible, because then if you get a consult, it's going to make so much more sense to you. You're going to have so much more meat on the bones to understand what they're talking about. So a lot of people are going to get tremendous breakthroughs with this. But unfortunately, what we're seeing more and more, especially in the last few years, is that there are more and more tough cases. The tough cases that used to be maybe 1%, now there may be 20 or 30% of people that come through are really tough cases. And now you have to start getting more data. You have to measure more things. And the next big thing that we're testing is the microbiome DNA analysis. And then we can also get a human DNA test for you to see what your predispositions are. And another thing I would recommend is to get a fatty acid test to measure your fatty acid status, the omega-3, omega-6 ratios, and your inflammatory status. But whatever you decide to do, I want you to realize that a lot of this is going to take some time. If you're a very simple case, then you could probably just eat way better and feel remarkably better in a couple of 3 months. But if you're one of these tough cases, then if it takes a year or maybe even 2, don't be surprised. But I would encourage you to stick with it because it's going to be worth it. And it's like, what other choices do we really have? And in my clinic, I've worked very hard with our telehealth team to develop a guided program to help take people through these tough cases. So I'll put some links down below for those who are interested in checking that out. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.